The afternoon sun of early March, 1943, shimmered against the snow-melt puddles that dotted the proving grounds of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. Inside a drafty Signal Corps test hut, a soft-spoken physicist named Edwin Howard Armstrong adjusted a bank of glowing vacuum tubes. Around him, two uniformed officers watched with folded arms, their faces half lit by the orange filaments of the transmitter rack. "Sir, you'll want to stand back," Armstrong said quietly, tightening a control knob marked frequency deviation. The signal generator beside him pulsed to life. A low hum filled the room, followed by the faint sound of marching boots broadcast from the receiver across the field, distant but unnervingly clear. One of the officers frowned. "You're out of band, Professor. That's not an authorized frequency." Armstrong barely looked up. "That's the point. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The words hung in the air like static. What he had just done, deliberately jumping his transmitter outside the assigned military band, was technically illegal under Signal Corps regulations. Yet the demonstration would expose a flaw so deep in existing radio doctrine that the United States Army would be forced to rewrite the way it thought about communication security. Within 2 years, the concept behind that forbidden frequency hop would make American battlefield radios nearly impossible to jam. To understand why the act seemed so reckless, one must recall what radio warfare looked like in those anxious months following the North African landings. The Axis powers had made radio deception and jamming a dark art. German Doppel radar chaff confused Allied sensors, while mobile transmitters in occupied France mimicked Allied call signs to lure bombers off course. Japanese operators in the Pacific disrupted artillery nets with bursts of noise timed precisely to the Americans' transmission schedule. Every army depended on the invisible ether, and every commander feared it. In that world, radio silence was safety. Transmission meant exposure. The doctrine was clear. Stay on a fixed frequency, minimize talk time, and pray the enemy did not find you. Yet, for men like Armstrong, that doctrine was a relic of a simpler, pre-industrial battlefield. He had spent 2 decades fighting an intellectual war over the very nature of radio itself. In 1933, he had patented frequency modulation FM, a technique that rejected the noisy amplitude systems that crackled across the airwaves. FM promised clarity, immunity to static, and the potential for much broader bandwidths. But the idea had made him enemies. The giants of commercial radio, centered around RCA, dismissed FM as a curiosity that threatened their existing AM monopolies. The U.S. Federal Communications Commission, lobbied heavily by corporate interests, restricted his frequencies to a narrow, ill-supported slice of spectrum. By the time global war erupted in 1939, Armstrong's technology was largely confined to laboratory benches and a few police departments. War, however, has a way of redistributing priorities. The U.S. Signal Corps, faced with the bitter lessons of early field radio's static-ridden AM sets that failed in rain, dust, and engine interference, began to revisit the unorthodox. Daniel Noble at Galvin Manufacturing, whose work would lead to the SCR-300 walkie-talkie, drew heavily on Armstrong's published research. But while Noble's achievement brought reliable FM voice to the infantry, it did not yet solve the darker problem of jamming. A determined enemy could still block a single channel by blasting it with noise. Armstrong's insight on that cold March afternoon went beyond modulation itself. He realized that if the transmitter could leap from one frequency to another faster than a human could tune, any attempt to jam would fail. The signal would be gone before interference arrived. It was, in essence, the seed of what later engineers would call frequency hopping, spread spectrum, a principle decades ahead of its time. But in 1943, it was heresy. Military regulations demanded strict frequency discipline. Unauthorized deviation was a court-martial offense. The Signal Corps men who witnessed the test recorded it as non-standard behavior and filed it away. Behind that bureaucratic phrase lay a deeper irony. Only months earlier, Another unlikely pair, actress Hedy Lamarr and composer George Antheil, had quietly patented a similar idea, a torpedo guidance system that hopped between frequencies according to a coded piano roll. Their concept, too, was dismissed as impractical. The Navy labelled it too complex for wartime implementation. The irony was painful. Within a generation, that same method would become the foundation of secure military radios and civilian technologies from Wi-Fi to Bluetooth. In 1943, though, Armstrong's experiment existed in a grey zone between vision and violation. The Signal Corps acknowledged his genius, but could not endorse what it viewed as an uncontrolled transmission practice. The Army's priority was reliability, not experimentation. Still, reports of the test filtered through technical channels, reaching younger engineers within the laboratories at Fort Monmouth and the Radio Research Division at Wright Field. They recognized something the administrators did not, that jamming could never be defeated by power alone, only by unpredictability. Across the Atlantic, German and Japanese engineers were reaching similar conclusions. The Luftwaffe's Fug-10 series of radios relied on fixed-channel AM sets vulnerable to Allied interference. By 1944, the Allies had perfected airborne jammers that could drown out entire German communication bands during bombing raids. The result was chaos. Pilots lost contact with ground control, armored units fought in isolation, and field commanders reverted to signal flares and runners. The Axis powers were being silenced by their own rigidity. Back in the United States, Armstrong watched the reports with both vindication and sorrow. His FM systems were performing flawlessly in field radios, but the illegal frequency jump concept remained untouched. The bureaucracy of war had little appetite for innovations that deviated from procurement specifications. He continued his experiments privately at his Alpine, New Jersey laboratory, a tall concrete tower overlooking the Hudson River, where he conducted high-power tests at night when civilian stations were off the air. Local residents sometimes complained of strange noises on their receivers, bursts of tones, rapid chirps, signals that seemed to dance across the dial. Armstrong never confirmed the rumors, but his lab notebooks describe rapid multi-channel modulation tests conducted through mid-1944. Those notebooks reveal the psychological dimension of his struggle. "The military fears disorder," he wrote in one entry. "But the enemy exploits predictability. The price of discipline may be vulnerability." In a war obsessed with control, the idea that safety lay in chaos was difficult to accept. Yet that paradox lay at the heart of his discovery. By constantly varying frequency in a mathematically determined pattern, a radio network could become invisible to any static listener. To jam it, the enemy would have to predict its next jump, a problem as difficult as breaking a cipher. The next decisive test would come not in a laboratory, but on the battlefields of Europe. By late 1944, Allied signal intelligence units had begun experimenting with diversity reception, switching between multiple receivers to counter fading and interference. When combined with narrowband FM, the results were remarkable. German attempts to blanket frequencies with noise were simply sidestepped by moving to a clear channel. Though not full frequency hopping, it proved the concept's viability. Reports circulated quietly through Allied Communications Command. American radios were becoming remarkably resistant to interference. The foundation of belief that radio discipline and fixed channels ensured security was beginning to crumble. Armstrong would not live to see his ideas fully vindicated, but in those wartime years, his insistence on defying authorized frequencies forced a philosophical shift inside the U.S. communications establishment. Order was no longer synonymous with safety. Adaptability was. The spring of 1944 brought thunder not only from the skies over Europe, but also across the electromagnetic spectrum. In every major Allied offensive from Anzio to Normandy, radio was both lifeline and liability. Field commanders carried new FM sets like the SCR 300, marveling at their clarity, yet they knew one truth above all. If the enemy found their frequency, the line could go dark in seconds. In one corner of that vast network of transmitters and antennas, a small research cell at Fort Monmouth revisited Armstrong's notes on rapid deviation, his forbidden frequency hopping tests from the year before. The problem was no longer theoretical. Reports from the Italian front confirmed that German listening stations had begun detecting and imitating American field call signs, creating confusion that could last hours. Division signal officers pleaded for a way to keep the enemy's ears guessing. A young engineer named Lieutenant Robert Haig was among those who believed Armstrong had already shown the path forward. Haig's unit quietly built a prototype called the AN-PRCX, a field transmitter capable of switching among several preset channels using a synchronized crystal sequence. The hardware was crude, no more than a switch-driven relay synchronized with a punched paper strip, but it worked. In tests, conventional jamming could only silence the signal for milliseconds before the receiver caught up on the next hop. For the first time, unpredictability had become an ally. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the very success of the experiment sparked institutional friction. The Signal Corps classified the test results, citing security and spectrum control issues. To the engineers, that meant bureaucracy was again strangling progress. To the administrators, it meant protecting stability in the middle of a global war. As one memo from the War Department phrased it, "We cannot alter the entire doctrine of frequency control for a system not yet proven in combat." Still, the quiet revolution continued in shadow. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, Allied communications depended largely on FM networks derived from Armstrong's principles. Each beachhead had multiple assigned channels, and operators were instructed to shift to alternates in case of interference. It was not true frequency hopping yet, but it was a first taste of what dynamic communication could be. German jammers discovered, too late, that their noise transmitters could not cover so many frequencies at once. The Allied radio net held chaotic, overlapping, but alive. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Armstrong's own battles were turning inward. RCA and the Federal Communications Commission continued to marginalize FM broadcasting, reallocating his civilian frequencies to television. The same nation that had quietly borrowed his technology for war seemed determined to erase him from its peacetime plans. He wrote bitterly in his journal, "They use it in the field while denying its name in the halls of policy. Yet even in isolation, his influence rippled outward." Military researchers studying post-invasion signal logs noticed a pattern. The units that changed frequencies, often, even without formal coordination, suffered fewer communication losses. The idea was simple: the more unpredictable the transmission, the harder it was to silence. Spread spectrum, though unnamed, had proven itself in practice before it was ever officially authorized. By the final months of the war, as Allied troops closed in on Germany, the Luftwaffe's command structure was collapsing under radio chaos. Allied jammers targeted fixed German frequencies with merciless precision, cutting divisions off from their headquarters. In the Pacific, Japanese forces at Leyte and Okinawa faced the same nightmare. Their once reliable tactical networks drowned beneath layers of American static, while U.S. forces coordinated attacks across wide bands using resilient FM and experimental multi-channel sets. The imbalance was decisive. Technology had turned the invisible battlefield into an asymmetric war of unpredictability, and the side that embraced chaos won. After the guns fell silent in 1945, the story of those forbidden frequency experiments faded into classified archives. The Signal Corps moved on to post-war standardization, while civilian communications shifted toward television and commercial broadcasting. Armstrong, exhausted by corporate litigation and disillusionment, continued to refine FM's technical limits at his Alpine laboratory. He would not live to see his name restored. In January 1954, overwhelmed by debt and betrayal, he took his own life, leaving behind notebooks filled with equations that later engineers would rediscover in astonishment. 2 decades later, during the height of the Cold War, those same principles resurfaced under a new name: spread spectrum communication. Engineers at Sylvania and later the US Navy adopted it for encrypted, anti-jam radios aboard aircraft and submarines. The once illegal idea became the very foundation of secure transmission. By the 1980 seconds, its civilian offspring, CDMA, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, would connect a world far beyond what Armstrong could have imagined. When the first modern military frequency-hopping radios entered service, a quiet line appeared in the documentation. Technique inspired by early theoretical work on frequency modulation and variable channel transmission. It was a bureaucratic phrase, almost sterile. But within those words lived the ghost of a man who dared to twist the dial when no one else would. His rebellion against control had become the architecture of global communication. Today, every encrypted signal, every Wi-Fi packet, every satellite link owes a silent debt to that March afternoon in 1943 when Edwin Howard Armstrong turned a forbidden knob and listened as his voice jumped across the airwaves. Free, elusive, uncatchable. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was uneasy. In the laboratories of post-war America, radio engineers found themselves standing on the shoulders of discoveries no one had dared to name. The new era demanded control-standardized frequencies, civilian oversight, tidy regulations. What it did not welcome was the ghost of a scientist who had once argued that the air itself could never be tamed. Edwin Howard Armstrong was gone, but his ideas lingered like afterimages in the circuitry. In 1948, the Signal Corps quietly began declassifying select wartime communication studies. Among them were the rapid deviation notes and field reports that referenced an unnamed physicist's experiment in illegal frequency modulation. To those who knew, the signature was obvious. Armstrong's fingerprints were on every schematic, the tuned coils, the broad deviation sweep, the handwritten annotations about avoiding predictable behavior. At first, the documents seemed like historical curiosities, but a small cadre of younger scientists recognized something larger hiding within them. One was Claude Shannon, the mathematician at Bell Labs, who had just published his paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication. Shannon's work turned information into a measurable quantity: bits, entropy, noise. When he read the declassified FM documents, he reportedly remarked that Armstrong had been engineering against entropy before we had a name for it. It was a bridge between generations, the experimentalist who felt his way toward the future and the theorist who defined it. As the Cold War deepened, unpredictability once again became survival. The Soviet Union's massive radar and signal interception networks threatened to expose every American radio source. Traditional encryption could hide the meaning of a transmission, but not its presence. The U.S. Navy needed something different, a way to talk without being found. That search led engineers back to the principle born in that drafty hut at Fort Monmouth: never transmit in one place long enough to be hit. By the early 1960 seconds, research programs such as Project Phoenix and Have Quick transformed the concept into operational systems. These frequency-hopping radios did not rely on random chaos, but on carefully synchronized pseudorandom sequences shared between transmitter and receiver. Each hop occurred thousands of times per second. To an enemy listener, the signal appeared as meaningless bursts scattered across the spectrum, static with a secret heartbeat. To the rightful receiver, it was crystal clear. When the system went active aboard aircraft over Vietnam, American pilots discovered that their communication channels stayed open even amid dense Soviet jamming. It was, finally, the full realization of Armstrong's wartime defiance. The forbidden experiment had become doctrine, yet recognition lagged far behind technology. Armstrong's name seldom appeared in official histories. The corporate giants, who had once fought him, now built fortunes atop the very mathematics his discoveries made possible. In a sense, his revenge was invisible, embedded in every radio wave that refused to stand still. By the 1980 seconds, the concept migrated quietly into civilian life. Engineers working on digital cellular networks and short-range wireless links borrowed directly from spread-spectrum military research. The first Wi-Fi protocols, standardized in the 1990 seconds, used frequency hopping to avoid interference. So did Bluetooth, the technology now embedded in millions of personal devices. The irony was cosmic. The same principle once branded illegal now pulsed through every phone, laptop, and satellite on Earth. If Armstrong could have tuned a receiver today, he would hear the proof of his vindication, a world alive with 1 trillion invisible voices, all sharing the same sky, none silenced by jamming. The chaos he once unleashed had become the backbone of global order. And so the story ends where it began. A man alone in a small room, surrounded by glowing tubes, defying authority with a twist of a dial. His act of rebellion reshaped not only warfare but the entire architecture of human communication. Every encrypted call, every GPS ping, every wireless heartbeat traces its ancestry to that moment in 1943 when a quiet engineer broke the rules and, in doing so, freed the signal forever. In the end, history tends to remember its generals, not its engineers. But every so often, a quiet mind alters the trajectory of war more profoundly than 1,000 guns. Edwin Howard Armstrong never sought fame. He sought clarity, not just in sound, but in truth. His radios were, in essence, mirrors of his own mind, disciplined yet daring, mathematical yet poetic. When he broke the rules of the Signal Corps in 1943, he wasn't rebelling against authority alone. He was rebelling against the very idea that discovery must wait for permission. After his death, his laboratory at Alpine stood empty for years, a concrete tower facing the Hudson, its transmitter silenced. Yet, even abandoned, it refused to fade. Ham radio operators in the area sometimes claimed they could still pick up faint carrier tones from its antennas on misty nights, a superstition perhaps, or a fitting metaphor. Because in truth, Armstrong never went silent. His ideas were already multiplying across the spectrum. By the 1970 seconds, engineers in defense think tanks began referring to a new doctrine: electromagnetic maneuver warfare. The notion was simple but radical: to treat the airwaves not as a fixed domain to be occupied, but as a living environment to be navigated. That philosophy echoed Armstrong's handwritten note from decades earlier: predictability is the enemy's compass. It was no longer heresy. It was strategy. When the first GPS constellation came online, when the first digital phones carried human voices over hopping frequencies, when Wi-Fi routers filled homes with invisible lattices of information, Armstrong's rebellion had come full circle. The forbidden jump had become civilization's heartbeat, but perhaps the deeper legacy lies beyond the circuits. Armstrong's story reminds us that progress often arrives disguised as disobedience, that the most transformative breakthroughs are not polished products of committee consensus, but sparks struck by individuals willing to defy comfort. Every generation inherits that choice: obey the limits of accepted knowledge, or risk failure in pursuit of something no one yet understands. If you listen closely, amid the static of modern life, the hum of routers, the whisper of satellites, the pulse of wireless networks, there is still a trace of that first forbidden signal leaping through the noise, a reminder that freedom, in any form, begins with someone daring to transmit when told to stay silent. The air is no longer empty. It carries the voice of a man who refused to be jammed. In the spring of 1945, as Berlin fell and the guns of Europe went silent, radio waves carried a different kind of sound relief, disbelief, and the strange quiet that follows the collapse of a storm. Across the Atlantic, buried in the static of peacetime transmissions, the invisible fingerprints of Edwin Howard Armstrong's technology continued their work. The same principles that had once been branded impractical or forbidden were now transmitting victory parades, repatriation orders, and the first global radio broadcasts of a new world that owed its communication stability to a man it had forgotten. The war had ended, but the airwaves were only beginning to fight their next battle, a quieter one, between innovation and inertia, freedom and control. Armstrong had shown that clarity could defeat chaos. The Signal Corps' once rigid doctrine of centralized narrowband command was already being rewritten by the realities of mobile warfare and electronic countermeasures. The Americans had learned that adaptability, the willingness to move through the spectrum instead of defending a single channel, was not weakness, it was evolution. By 1950, the principles born in the clandestine frequency-hopping tests had expanded into a doctrine that shaped everything from the Strategic Air Command's secure links to the early radar counter-jamming systems used in the Korean War. The scientists who built those systems rarely mentioned Armstrong's name. Some didn't even know it. But they all worked within a framework that he had first glimpsed in the haze of pre-war skepticism, a world where communication wasn't a fixed frequency, but a living pulse, capable of eluding even the most determined enemy. Meanwhile, in civilian life, a quieter revolution was brewing. Commercial radio had turned into a battlefield of its own, not of armies, but of corporations. Armstrong, battered by years of legal warfare with RCA and Sarnoff, watched as his FM patents were challenged, diluted, and appropriated. The same system that had hailed him as a wartime savior now called him a liability, too proud, too stubborn, too unwilling to compromise. He had defied generals and survived, but the corporate battlefield proved colder. On a grey morning in January 1954, Armstrong walked out of his apartment on East 86th Street and into legend. His death, a single moment of surrender after decades of brilliance, was both an ending and a transmission. His widow, Marion, would later dedicate her life to restoring his name, fighting legal battles he never lived to see. Decades later, courts would finally acknowledge what history already knew, that the illegal frequency jumps, the forbidden modulation schemes, and the untamed defiance of one man had shaped every wireless system on Earth. But history's irony ran deeper still, because while Armstrong's life ended in silence, his ideas were already whispering across the frontiers of science. In the late 1950s, a young mathematician named Hedy Lamarr, once a Hollywood actress, had quietly patented a concept for spread spectrum transmission, inspired by the same frequency agility Armstrong had championed. Though her work went unrecognized for years, it would later form the backbone of secure military communication and eventually the wireless internet itself. The invisible bridge between Armstrong and Lamarr spanned continents and decades, connecting two lives separated by war but united by one principle: that freedom of signal is freedom of thought. By the time the Vietnam War began, American radios no longer feared jamming. Their channels danced across bands so fast that no enemy transmitter could follow. Airborne command centers, naval vessels, and even ground troops used frequency-agile systems that embodied Armstrong's heresy, the doctrine that no single channel could be sacred. The air itself had become a battlefield, but one governed by mathematics, not territory. In 1979, as the first cellular networks began testing in Chicago, engineers quietly acknowledged that their entire foundation rested on spread spectrum theory, frequency hopping, error correction, adaptive filtering, the ghosts of the Forbidden War experiments. Armstrong's invisible hand was there again, in every transmission that refused to stand still. And yet, for all its technical triumph, his story remains a moral parable, one that modern innovators ignore at their peril. Because Armstrong's tragedy was not that his ideas were rejected, it was that his integrity was punished. He refused to simplify truth for comfort. He refused to dilute science to appease bureaucracy. And he paid the price that so many visionaries pay, the loneliness that comes from seeing too far ahead of one's time. In a letter preserved at Columbia University, Armstrong once wrote, "It is the fate of those who change the world to never live long enough to enjoy it." Today, that line feels prophetic. Every Bluetooth signal, every encrypted satellite link, every Wi-Fi transmission hopping invisibly through the air, they all carry his signature. The same physics he sketched on chalkboards in a cold Manhattan lab now sustains billions of conversations every second. His rebellion has become infrastructure, and somewhere in that irony lies the ultimate peace. Because Armstrong never fought for recognition, he fought for purity of signal, of purpose, of science. In a war defined by deception and noise, he gave the Allies something pure, communication that could not be silenced. And in doing so, he left behind a philosophy that transcends technology, that clarity, whether in thought or in transmission, is not given freely. It is won against interference both electrical and human. In the quiet spectrum above us, invisible waves still leap from one frequency to another millions of times per second. Each jump, each whisper, each unbroken link between transmitter and receiver is an act of remembrance, a continuation of the defiance that began in a cramped laboratory before the war, when one man, surrounded by skeptics, dared to ask, what if silence could be beaten by motion? That question echoes still, through every device, every battlefield, every whisper of code that rides upon the air. And so the story ends not with death, but with transmission eternal, invisible, unstoppable. Because the truth Armstrong discovered was never really about radios. It was about the human voice itself, forever searching, forever leaping, forever refusing to be jammed. In the years that followed, the world moved on. New wars came, new names filled the headlines, and technology advanced with the inevitability of tide and time. Yet, behind every signal that crossed the ocean, every coded message sent through orbiting satellites, there lingered a trace of Edwin Howard Armstrong's mind, the quiet insistence that clarity could survive chaos. His tower at Alpine still stands, overlooking the Hudson River like a monument to invisible victories. Its rusted antennas no longer hum with life, but the structure itself feels alive, a relic not of failure, but of endurance. Visitors who climb its narrow staircase sometimes describe the same strange sensation, that the air grows denser the higher they ascend, as if layered with the residue of voices that once defied the noise of the world. Beneath those antennas, Armstrong had spent nights testing his forbidden frequencies, listening to the ether shift and shimmer as he pushed beyond what regulations allowed. He understood, more than anyone, that invention is not simply an act of intellect, it is an act of faith. You must believe that order can be found in the static. During the war, that faith had practical consequence. His modulation principles allowed American convoys to coordinate under storm and shellfire, their communications unbroken even as enemy transmitters screamed across the spectrum. And though his name was rarely mentioned in dispatches, every secure transmission that reached its target without distortion was, in essence, a fragment of his rebellion made manifest. Yet history's greatest ironies are often buried in its smallest details. The same military establishment that had once dismissed his methods later built entire doctrines upon them. The same corporations that had argued his patents into ruin would one day sell consumer electronics built upon those very frequencies. Armstrong had been right not just technically, but philosophically. To move through noise instead of fighting it head-on was not cowardice, it was wisdom. The lesson extended far beyond engineering. The century that followed would be defined by interference political, informational, moral. Nations would wrestle with new kinds of static, propaganda, censorship, the distortion of truth itself. In that sense, Armstrong's principle of frequency agility became a metaphor for survival in the modern age. To endure is to adapt to shift one's wavelength until clarity returns. And yet, beneath all the progress, the personal tragedy remains. Armstrong's final notes were full of equations, not farewells. His last letter contained no bitterness, only exhaustion, the fatigue of a man who had spent his life translating lightning into language, only to be told his words were too bright. The world eventually vindicated him, but only in retrospect. His story is a reminder that recognition is a currency paid to the dead, that genius often speaks at frequencies too high for its own time to hear. Today, every soldier's encrypted radio, every plane's collision avoidance signal, every satellite link circling the globe operates in the silence. He created a silence made possible by movement, by continuous, invisible defiance. It is a silence that protects, that connects, that endures. If you listen long enough to the hum of a modern transmitter, if you close your eyes and let the sound dissolve into background air, you can almost imagine the faint echo of his first forbidden leap, a note that slipped past authority and into eternity. The world may never fully grasp how much was born in that act, for in that single illegal jump across the spectrum, Armstrong proved that freedom is not a political condition. It is a physical one, the ability of a signal to travel unbroken through the darkness, carrying truth past every barrier built to contain it. And so, the story that began in secrecy ends in omnipresence. Every device that connects us, every whisper of data in the air, is a monument not of stone, but of frequency, a living memorial to the man who refused to be jammed. His rebellion became the rhythm of the modern world. The tower still stands, the sky still hums, and somewhere above the Hudson, an invisible wave still moves through the night, steady, faithful, unending. The silence, at last, speaks. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.